Hello everyone, and welcome back to Nailing Your Thesis, our course on how to perform research. We are currently discussing the structure and layout of research papers and research theses, and after discussing the opening and the related work sections, we will now talk about the contributions part of a research paper, which is that part where you lay out the actual research work that you have done, show how it's true, how it's novel, and that is the actual reason why you're writing this research paper. So the contributions section typically has three sections. Titles and actual content varies a little bit. Typically it varies by the type of research, specifically whether you are doing exploratory research or confirmatory research and using according methods. So if it's an exploratory contribution or research, then you would start out with a section on your research question, followed by a section on maybe the research methods you chose and the results you got from the consequent data gathering. So somewhere between question and results, there is approach and method and the data you gathered. And finally, there is a discussion of these contributions as to what can be learned from your qualitative exploratory research. If it's confirmatory research, it's a bit more strict in that the assumption is your first section will lay out the theory that you're going to validate, or at least partially validate. So that's the theory, and ideally specific hypotheses that you're going to show are true or not true. And then the next section is the validation, where you actually show how these hypotheses evaluate to true or false, and how possibly the whole theory is true or false. And finally, you discuss limitations in that in the third section, meaning limitations or threats to validity of your research work. It's this blue part in the overall structure of a research paper, and something like 50 to 80% perhaps. So maybe it's 6 pages, 7 pages at max in a 10-page computer science paper. The theory section or the research question actually is, if you will, contains your main contribution, the question, already possibly the answers, and you provide significantly more detail as to what it is that you are trying to answer. Somehow in there, the approach of how you're going to answer, it's either in section 6 or section 7. It depends a little bit on your example. So if it's the presentation of a theory that you're going to validate, then your research paper is likely to not fully validate a theory, but only some selected hypotheses. So you need to present both the theory and the hypotheses that follow from that theory, and maybe how some larger research question is being answered by pulling together these hypotheses into an argument that gives you an answer to some research question. The specifics really depend on your particular research question and paper and the novel insight, and thereby can vary significantly. What we have discussed is the logic of the arguments you make. And if the argument, for example, is that this theory is valid, then you need a large set of hypotheses that you show are true, which will then come together to conclude that the theory is true. Hypotheses themselves may be only validated by drawing on smaller, less comprehensive hypotheses, but those taken together might show the main superordinate hypothesis is true. You can see this here in this tree structure. The depth of this tree is, for most research papers, a little bit over the top, but might be a good display of, say, a large research study like a dissertation built from multiple papers. You can see how here hypotheses with hypothesis 1 being something like the presented theory is true or correct, then split up into these sub-hypotheses. The way of how these subordinate hypotheses are put together depends on the particular logic of the argument, inductive, deductive. We've discussed this before. And you can also see here the typical numbering scheme, which implies the logic and the overall argument, research argument hierarchy. So then you would present your theory either partially or fully by traversing this tree. And again, for a particular paper, in the context of a larger work, you might just be talking about a subtree. So you traverse that tree depth first, present as a consequence the hypotheses in a linear fashion, because writing requires linear text, and you precisely define each and every hypothesis. You spell it out in wording, and then you operationalize the terms, so you make it really precise to understand what it is you're saying, and also fulfill later quality criteria like, for example, the ability, the right objectivity that some other researcher can repeat the work. At this point of time, because your definitions already need to make sense, you can point to how you're going to validate these hypotheses, because only that way sometimes is it apparent to a reader why you choose a particular definition. Let's use an example. The tag theory paper, the other example research paper, here was about the use of subject line tags in email communication. And it was a theory of human behavior as to how humans would use certain tags in order to communicate different types of information, commands, informational content, questions to other people. And so presented as a whole theory, you do the usual thing, you provide context again, but then you jump into your string of hypotheses of different levels in the hierarchy and try to be as precise as you can. So hypothesis 1 here is emails have one purpose, or at least well-written emails. Well, that's a claim. Everyone knows that maybe not so well-written emails have multiple purposes and are confusing, but the point here is software developers, when communicating for technical purposes on a mailing list, write emails such that they have one purpose. That's the best practice, actually, but that remains to be shown. So at this stage, it's a hypothesis. You could linearly walk through small findings like a particular tag X, ANN, has a particular meaning. It's an announcement, and that's the only thing that should be in the email. Or a vote is a request for votes in some election or some decision process, etc. The hypotheses should be structured such that the tree really works out as a nice argument. We discussed quality criteria for that before. Let me remind you that best is to build it MISI. These different hypotheses are mutually exclusive, but taken together completely exhaustive. So you avoid overlap, but taken together, it covers the whole ground domain, etc. So going back to the other example, open source sustainability, you provide context, you operationalize your terms so that your hypotheses make sense, so there's precise meaning to the words in the hypotheses, because right now we're discussing an example of confirmatory research. And then again, you list your hypotheses, now based on precisely defined terms. And again, the linear order follows the traversal of the argument tree as you're trying to show that a hypothesis or a subtree is correct, or possibly even the whole theory is correct, as the top hypothesis of such a tree might be this theory is valid. So that is section 6. And description of what you are going to show, probably, or what you're going to evaluate, hopefully going to show is true. And now you need to do it. So if you haven't discussed the approach of how you're going to show that it's true yet, you do that in the next section. And you also will present your results. So approach and results often go together. You describe the approach, and then next subsections come the results. Usually, even though it's a lot of time for you to gather the data, in the writing of a research paper, you only describe how and why, what your approach is to gathering the data, and then suddenly it's there. So there's quite a difference between how you actually spend your time and the space devoted to writing about it in a research paper. So the section of the validation, so the validation section has that purpose of showing how and why your claims say that these hypotheses are true, are actually true. There will always be limitations, but that comes later. So in the validation section, you describe your approach. If you haven't done so yet, you operationalize your terms, and then you walk through the hypotheses, or you walk through the claims one by one, pick them off the tree, show that they are true, and of course at the end possibly assemble them again into the larger argument. The validation section thereby mirrors the theory, or the linear presentation of hypotheses as a linear rolled out form of the argument tree, and you walk through it again step by step, making sure that nothing is left uncovered. Here the tag theory validation, you explain the example paper on the subject line tags. So we used the survey approach. We codified each hypothesis as a set of questions in there, as you do good survey research, and we created a long, somewhat longish survey that would cover all hypotheses one by one, etc. And so you explain how you do it in writing. Then you report about the results as you got the results of your survey. So the execution of the survey in terms of getting it to people, you may talk about that, but again, it's probably rather short. Nobody wants to hear how hard it was to get all those respondents. People only care about the results of your legwork. So then you present those results, and you pick off again, you validate your hypotheses one by one with the data as relevant to them, and present it to the readers. If it's a lot of hypotheses, like in the tag example, then you would be using, say, a table to provide an overview. You usually don't have space to cover every little statistically relevant detail, but you only give an overview if there's space lacking. If it's necessary for building trust that more information is given, you may put it into a companion technical report that you publish through the university. There you have any amount of space that you might need. Still, you present the results for each hypothesis one after another, but since each hypothesis might warrant its own discussion, you discuss it in place exactly where it comes about. It could be any confusion or confounding factors, maybe some in the survey, some question was phrased badly, whatever might be relevant. So you qualify step by step the results and the data and the results you got from it. So going back to the sustainability example, we explain, of course, our approach again, how we gathered that data, and also how we then traverse the hypothesis step by step. One way of presenting in this example, in the sustainability example, is to present it visually as a graph, since we are talking about growth, so not as a table. whatever the research question and or the theory and the approach, they all lend themselves to particular ways of presentation. Sometimes a table is best, sometimes a graphics or a chart is best. You choose that based on how you believe you can most effectively convey the results of your work. And you do that, you apply it to the hypothesis, you spell out the steps, you put it all together at the end. Some of the terms, as I mentioned, are defined as early as with the hypotheses, if they are necessary to be understood as part of the theory section. They should be defined by the first time they occur. By the first time they occur might also be the last point in time where you possibly then introduce them if you haven't done it before. Sometimes you can push it back, or you can push it to some separate section if there is an intuitive meaning to it, and so you think readers don't need to see the specific precise definition, and that's it. Sometimes if it's so long that it just doesn't even fit the paper, then it also goes into a technical report. So now you have presented your theory, and then you have presented your approach and the results and what it means for the hypothesis, say in the theory section. And now you will have to discuss your results. So it's a discussion of the findings in exploratory research and a discussion of the limitations or threats to validity in the case of confirmatory research. And that is good research behavior because no research is perfect. Data always has imperfections. There's always challenges to data gathering, things that might have gone wrong. And you need to show that you understand that. If you don't, reviewers will automatically assume you're trying to pull a fast one. So you need to consistently work through any potential challenges to your work, limitations that you discovered yourself. As a critical and honest scientist, you also need to take a step back and ask yourself, what else that I didn't immediately think about would be relevant to discuss here, in order to honestly communicate how far the progress of your research work actually went. So also, of course, you will need to put into context those limitations. So it's not about beating yourself up. Rather, you really honestly show how serious or not so serious the limitations are, as well as proactively answer any potential misunderstanding. Ultimately, the limitation section is still about why your work is worth publishing, despite these limitations that you want to talk about. So these sections have different names depending on the type of research and approaches chosen. It's a discussion section if you're talking about exploratory research. It's the limitations or more common threats to validity section. If it's confirmatory, highly empirical research, etc. So in that limitation section, you provide that categorized breakdown of your limitations. And it's like a related work section. You need to structure it well so that readers don't get lost. You can distinguish, as mentioned, between real limitations, so things that as an honest scientist you really want to discuss, you need to understand yourself, and what I call here unwarranted objections, because reviewers are human, and they may understand some of the things that you have done and have objections to your work that are just not valid, just misunderstandings. So if you see, or based on prior experience know, that there are certain types of misunderstandings that reviewers might fall prey to, then you really need to address them up front. And this is not up front, but at the latest here in the limitations section. And that's why you do it here, even if it's not serious from a scientific perspective. Real limitations are good because they really help yourself to understand what you did and possibly define future work as you want to overcome these limitations. Unwarranted objections, if you will, are bad because it's really just about avoiding misunderstanding but you have to do it. All right. So these limitations, the typical way of structuring it in confirmatory research is to go by the quality criteria, external validity, internal validity, etc., etc. And for each of those, there's just a large number of potential biases or problem sources, etc. Too many for me to show them here, but let's say just external validity, or can you generalize? Well, maybe you didn't have access to the whole population. Maybe you had access to a subset and it's not clear how representative that subset of the population really was for the general population, and maybe you made some wrong assumptions. Things like that really need to be discussed, because then you showed that, say, your theory holds true for a subset of the population, but maybe not for all of it. Doesn't mean it's not a valid research result, but now it's limited. It's still publishable, but now you have a limitation and you need to openly and cleanly discuss that. There's just so many limitations, forms of it. You will learn them with experience. You learn them by reading other people's work and so forth. And so this will lead you to write good limitation studies sections, as well as to better set up your own studies in the future. Some of these limitations are simply, if you will, bad luck, or things how they played out as you gather data, so you can't do much about it. Sometimes you make mistakes, so you handle a sample and you ruin it. Still, you can possibly get information or data from it. You just need to disclose your mistakes. So, if you made a mistake, it doesn't necessarily invalidate your work. You just need to discuss it as a limitation. And hopefully you can show the extent of the limitations it introduced, and hopefully it doesn't ruin all of your work, but only limits it a little bit further. So here's a real limitation example from the tag survey. We didn't nearly get as many answers as we hoped for, respondents as we hoped for. That's a common problem with surveys. So as a consequence, often a low response rate means it's questionable that you can generalize, because how did you sample the whole population properly so that it's representative? We have to assume we did not. So you discuss that. You don't necessarily say that all of your research is bad now, but you now have that limitation, so you don't fundamentally challenge your research. You just show how the scope of the claims was reduced by these particular limitations that you found. So you embrace your limitations rather than keep whining on them. So in a different example, someone might simply say, oh, I'm sure this is not representative for this or that reason. If you already know that argument might come and you think it's wrong, then it's one of those unwarranted objections that I've been talking about. So you also have to address this, but you do so in such a way that you spell out what you believe people might object, and then show why that objection simply does not hold. So one may wonder about the representative, blah, blah, and you argue why you believe it is actually representative. And so you need to first recognize those objections. Maybe you get them from having your friends review your paper, and then you pick them off one by one and show how they are probably not true. So then, this was the section or the session on the contribution session. We discussed the 3 key sections of that part that makes up contributions, which is the research question or theory section, the approach and answers or the validation section, and then the discussion or limitations section, depending on whether it's exploratory or confirmatory research. Naturally, out of necessity, if you will, given time, I was rather high level. We work with you in our research projects to get it right, and only in the details of a particular project can you decide on how to do it well. So that's it from me for now. Thank you very much for your attention, and we will see each other for the next session where we will close the research paper. See you then.